Welcome to Ask the Attorney, brought to you by Stephen Kelly Law.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Renee Charles, your host of Ask the Attorney, and with me tonight, I have Stephen Kelly. I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm going to let him do most of the talking because obviously I've got a little bit of a cold tonight. But this topic that we're going to be talking about tonight is something that I think was going to be either one of the most popular we've had so far or possibly one of the most popular we will have. We're talking about recreational marijuana. And we want to preface the conversation by saying we don't have all the answers. This law is going into effect the 1st of January, but there are still so many things we don't know. So we want people to call in, ask your questions. The phone number is 698-3742, right there on your screen, 698-3742. Give us a call. We'll try to answer as best we can. But we're going to start off with the basics. So what do we know about this new law that goes into effect on January 1?
This is an exciting law. It's going to affect everyone from police officers to individuals, and it deals with an individual's right to use marijuana recreationally. And so what this law is going to do, it's going to allow individuals who are 21 to smoke marijuana legally, recreationally now, and they'll be able to do so without being worried about being prosecuted under the law.
But there are some caveats to that. You can't just smoke out on the street while you're going into a bar or at a school or whatever. There are significant limitations on where you can actually smoke marijuana.
One of the reasons why we decided on this topic was because it does involve the thought process of, something now that is legal that was not legal. And I want to make sure that people understand it doesn't mean you can walk out in the streets, doesn't mean you can drive your car and smoke marijuana. There are restrictions on this. The new law that's going to be in place is going to allow you to smoke in your own residence. It's also going to allow you to smoke in a dispensary or a realtor store that sells marijuana. However, there are restrictions on where you can smoke this marijuana. You cannot smoke it out in public. You cannot smoke the marijuana in your vehicle. You cannot smoke marijuana on school property. And one of the most litigated issues that may come down the road is you cannot smoke if you are a tenant in the landlord's house if he does not or she does not allow you to do so.
Yeah, that's one thing I want to dive into because a lot of people think, well, it's legal, so I can just go do it. But if you live in an apartment or a condominium complex, or say you're staying at a hotel and they don't allow you to do it, then therefore it is illegal for you to do it.
Yeah, this is going to be an issue. Landlords are going to call their attorneys. There's going to be discussions between landlords and tenants about this issue. Because if you're not allowed, and if the lease says you're not allowed to smoke marijuana, you are not allowed to do so. It may be a negotiable issue between the landlord and tenant, meaning that they can talk about it and decide whether or not they want to do so. But the landlord's got to be careful. One of the reasons I think they are allowing a landlord to prohibit it is because the health hazards of smoking marijuana. Unlike alcohol, you do have secondhand smoke that landlords have to worry about and other tenants. Also the fire factor, or the factor that now you may have someone, it's a hazard. And so a landlord has to consider that when they're going to control the use of marijuana in their houses or apartments or condos.
And there is an age restriction.
Yes.
You have to be 21, just same with alcohol, you have to be 21. What about the amount that you can have on you? Not so much the consumption, but how much can you carry around with you?
You're going to be allowed to have an ounce to carry around with you. And it's measured that way because if you go beyond that, if you have a tremendous amount of marijuana on you, you're going to all of a sudden look like you're distributing marijuana.
Well, that was my question there.
And that's what the law enforcement and the government does not want you to do. That is an amount that they've decided in the legislature that is allowable for you to carry around without being violating the laws in relation to the possession of this.
And since you can't have it in a lot of places, let's talk about schools. I know I work at Bradley, and we're talking about this, the Safe Schools Act, I believe it's called, or Drug-Free Schools Act, which means we can set up our parameters around, and we will not allow it on our campus.
Each university in Illinois, each campus in Illinois is allowed to restrict the use of marijuana or allow or not allow their students to use it. I will anticipate, and I think that more than not, they're not going to allow it for various reasons. And this is the recreational aspect of the marijuana use. We're talking here tonight about recreational use of marijuana. That is different than medicinal, which has already been on the books.
Right. One other piece of this legislation that I think is fascinating is that it will be illegal for you to smoke marijuana around any person who is an on-duty bus driver, police officer, firefighter, first responder, because of the effects of that secondhand smoke.
So think of the user. They're now restricted on who they can smoke around. The law also talks about they cannot smoke around anybody under the age of 21.
Okay.
So you got under the age of 21, you've got a bus driver, you've got, as you identified, the police officer and firemen, because they can take it in and they can test positive by taking it in. So it's for the protection of not only those individuals, but they're trying to keep that separated for jobs or responsibilities of others.
And we mentioned that a landlord can stop you from smoking it in that dwelling. An employer, this is a call that came in, can an employer restrict smoking in any way?
Yes, an employer can restrict it, especially recreational. If it's a recreational use, an employer can forbid or not have you do it on their premises. There's other reasons why employers would opt not to do it, and we can talk about that later in the show about the responsibilities and job duties of your place of employment, you as an employee. If it's recreational use, an employer has an absolute right in Illinois to restrict your use on their premises.
Here's a question that came in. Smoking while driving. We just kind of talked about that. You can't do it. It's same with alcohol.
Yeah.
Drinking while driving is illegal.
It's a great question. I think that this is the mind of everybody is, okay, now this is legal for me to do. How do I do it? Where can I do it? And driving, like a cigarette, you can smoke a cigarette while you're driving a car. But marijuana recreationally is not allowed in your vehicle to be smoked under this new law. You cannot do it while you're driving.
And how about being tested? I think we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper as we go on, but there are a lot of questions about how we're going to test for this.
Yeah, and the testing aspect, we are going to get into a little bit later, but it depends on what you're talking about, the testing. Are they testing because you're suspected of driving under the influence? Or are you being tested because of your job duties? All these issues are going to come up on when you can be tested, and the conflict is now this is a legal law. Now this is something you can do, and you're allowed to have this in your system. The question becomes how much, and what are your job responsibilities at work, and does that conflict with the obligation of the employer to keep their patrons safe?
Here's a very interesting one. If you are court ordered for drug testing, how will this affect that now that marijuana is legal?
Well, you're court ordered for drug testing probably for a reason. It's probably not a good reason. And I am telling you that court order is going to override any new law that's coming in. Thus, if you are court ordered for testing and you have been told you have to go for testing, I would follow that court order. It's an order of a judge, and I certainly wouldn't violate that or challenge that if you're told not to have positive testing in your court order.
All right, let's go over these rules one more time before we take a quick break. Must be 21.
Must be 21.
You must be in your own dwelling. You can only have 1 ounce on you. Not allowed in public spaces, motor vehicles, or around anyone who is a first responder, a bus driver, or any type of official in that sense.
And absolutely. And once again, the medicinal use of marijuana may alter that, meaning that if someone has a medicinal card for school, if they have a condition that's diagnosed, they may be allowed to do it at a school for medicinal purposes. That's between them and the school to work it out. The points you identified are for recreational use only.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll take some more of your calls. So write the number down, 698-3742. You're watching Ask the Attorney. Stephen Kelly, Renee Charles. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back. You're watching Ask the Attorney. I'm Renee Charles, along with Stephen Kelly. And we had a really good question that just came in. We're talking about recreational marijuana. And this caller wants to know, what is CBD compared to THC, and how the levels differentiate with the euphoria that it gives you?
So they're both from the same plant. Those are compounds made up of the cannabis plant. There are compounds found in that plant, one's CBD, one's THC. The difference is the effects of those chemicals or those compounds on the body. CBD does not have the hallucinating effects that the other compound does, meaning that it gives you a feeling of happiness, of well-being. There's not that hallucinant that's found in THC that is contained in what we're talking about, the legalization of marijuana, the recreational marijuana. So if you had to break it down, THC allows you to have that high, the euphoria, where CBD does not. And as you people have noticed there's probably CBD stores around,
Yep.
and those help you with conditions such as you can use it for arthritis, the oil you can rub on, and it makes you feel better, but doesn't have that hallucinant feeling that THC does.
So when talking about THC, it stays in the body longer. So let's talk THC and alcohol.
Right.
Alcohol, you can see how it impacts the body and the impairment. Some people it's a little more difficult than others, but THC is even more difficult than that because of the way it impacts you.
There's a relationship with alcohol intake and impairment. The more alcohol you drink, the more someone can tell how impaired you are during that process of taking in alcohol. THC is different. THC is measured differently, and each person's different on how THC affects them. One of the things that a lot of people are going to explore and discover during this process is how does THC even affect them at all? Some people may have even tried marijuana, and it's going to be different for each person. But THC does stay in the system longer. The detection of THC could be in the body for 2 weeks, while alcohol is less than 24 to 48 hours. So the body processes each different alcohol versus THC, and the effects each have a different. More immediate with alcohol, THC is a little bit of a delayed effect, but still stays in the system a lot longer.
So if it's staying in your system, you get pulled over. How do we test it?
Great question. Police officers are going to have a very difficult job with
It's going to be tough on them.
with recreational THC. Reason being is when an officer pulls you over, he has to make or she has to make a determination. Are you impaired? Are you unable to drive? Are you impaired? And what's causing that impairment? And when THC becomes involved, more likely than not, it's not going to be because of you smoked marijuana 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago or a week ago. It's more immediate than that. Now, the officer is going to have to make a determination of whether or not they suspect THC involvement. That is the slurred speech, just like an alcohol stop. And they'll start making the reasonable conclusions of whether or not they can go to the next step and test you for the THC.
So talk about driving privileges if you were to get pulled over and they make the determination that you are under the influence of marijuana. What can happen to is your license revoked? Is it a ticket like you would driving under the influence of alcohol? Is it the same with marijuana?
The legalization of recreational marijuana is going to create all this new litigation in civil courts, criminal courts. Like alcohol, if you refuse the breathalyzer, your license gets suspended until that can be determined at a hearing or a trial later. That's going to be the same way with THC. If you refuse that test, there's a potential your license is going to be suspended.
How is this going to work with a FOID card? This is a question that came in. If you're smoking, do you have to give up your right to a FOID card or your right to carry a weapon?
Boy, that's a great question because that...
Again, getting down in the weeds, we don't know everything.
That's a great question because now we're looking about a federal privilege, a FOID card. And this recreational use of marijuana is not legal federally. And so what happens now is you're getting into the rights of carrying a FOID card and you're smoking marijuana. There is a chance that if they determine that you're guilty or you've had THC in your system, you risk potentially losing your FOID card.
So there is that chance?
There is that chance. Marijuana is not legalized from a federal standpoint.
And different cities are opting in, different cities are opting out. So if it's approved by the state, but not federally, but Peoria has it, but maybe East Peoria doesn't. How does this work varying from city to city? Number one, how does it work? And number two, if you have it with you, and you're traveling from city to city, do you have to know what cities allow it and what don't?
No, I think that the way the law is written, the new law is written, is municipalities have a right to control this issue, whether or not they want to allow the dispensary and the sale of it within their the boundaries. You can, in my understanding is you could still drive around with it in Illinois if you have it in you, cross through Morton and come back, and I think you're okay as long as you're a resident of the city that's legal.
Okay. Purchasing it. We've got a couple of questions here about purchasing marijuana.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that is also still concerning because people are wondering, well, if we're going to have dispensaries set up, I can go in and purchase it anywhere. How are they going to know if you bought it at a dispensary or if you bought it from someone who's selling it illegally?
I think the state of Illinois is going to track this very carefully. One of the reasons why this is now becoming legal is because of the tax situation. And therefore, I think it's going to be tracked very well. And I think that your sale and purchase will be able to be determined through the POA system at the dispensary. And I think
You might almost have to have like a receipt for it or something like that.
Yeah, you may. And there's going to be licensing to these dispensaries, and they're going to be strict about it. And they're not going to let myself or someone who doesn't have a license sell the marijuana.
Right.
So you really risk a lot of issues if you don't follow the procedures. They can get a license to do so, and I would not recommend getting it off the street and then try to tell an officer or mislead the authority that you got it from a licensed place and you did not.
And there are going to be a lot of extra taxes on this, so the state's really going to be watching this because they're looking at it as a potential revenue stream.
Yeah, it's a revenue stream. People smoke marijuana. We know that, and this may open the door to people who want to do it recreationally. And this allows some tax revenue for the state that we didn't have until this upcoming year. The other side effect that we have to consider is insurance rates. If we have more people driving, and if there's more issues, and if there's more impaired drivers, the question becomes, are there going to be more accidents? And if you're an individual who is convicted of violating the THC levels, your insurance rates could go up.
Let's hit the workers' compensation thing real quickly. If you're in an accident or have an accident at work, how could this, because if you're impaired, how does that impact the workers' compensation claim?
The Workers' Compensation Act in Illinois already had a statute in place, a law in place, and it happened in 2011. And that law basically said that if you are impaired or you have marijuana in your system, that there's a presumption that it's not a work-related injury. And the presumption switched to the injured person to prove that they weren't so intoxicated they can do their job. I think that's still in place, and that's still going to be in place. So if you get injured and they determine that, and they could drug test you, and you have THC in your system, there is a presumption that that accident's not work-related until you, as the injured worker, can prove that you weren't intoxicated, meaning you showed up at work, no one sent you home. You did your work for 7 hours that day. No one noticed that you were impaired. That all goes into the trial of the case to determine not you're entitled to benefits.
But this is very similar to alcohol. Yeah. Whereas if you have an accident at work and it's found that you are under the influence of alcohol, that impacts how your case goes.
Absolutely.
This is the same thing.
Absolutely. And once again, alcohol is a little bit more immediate. You go to work with alcohol in your breath and you're impaired, more likely the employer is going to see that and send you home or say you're fired.
Right.
THC could be in your system and you could have smoked a week ago. There's not a chance the employers can detect that you did smoke marijuana a week ago. So it comes down to the question of how impaired were you? Were you even impaired when the accident occurred? And did that THC have any effect on your accident? It may not have. But the Illinois legislature changed the work comp law in 2011. And what that said was, if you are found to test positive, then you are presumed not to have an accident which occurred in your employment unless you prove otherwise. And they shifted the burden to that person that has that in their system.
You have to prove it yourself as
Yes.
opposed to the other way around.
Exactly.
All right, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we'll take a few more of your calls. 698-3742. You're watching Ask the Attorney. Welcome back to Ask the Attorney. I'm Renee Charles along with Stephen Kelly. And I was right, this is a pretty popular topic today. We've got lots of questions coming in. 698-3742 is the number. We're talking about recreational marijuana. I want to remind people we don't know all of the answers. This becomes legal January 1, and there are still a lot of questions. How do I transport from the dispensary to my home? Because we just said you can't have it in the car.
Yeah, you can't smoke it in the car, and you can't ingest it in the car, but you can certainly buy it
Transport
and
it.
transport it back to your residence.
Okay.
That is perfectly legal as long as you're under the legal amount.
Let's talk about job issues. The employment issues that we may have based on your job title, the duties that you do. So just because this may be legal now, certain positions, it's still going to be illegal for you to do.
Yeah.
And at the workplace, it's probably just not a good idea to do it in general.
No, at the workplace, it's not a great idea. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody.
Just don't do it.
You may lose your job if you decide to recreationally use marijuana. Don't do it. But the employer has a right to control or at least regulate who can use marijuana and not. For example, job titles is very important as to what an employer does and doesn't do, allowing it. If you're a bus driver, if you're in the medical field, certainly the employer has a right to say, we don't want you to be using THC. You have children's lives in your hands and you are in the medical field. So the employer has a right to say, we are drug-free. And if you violate that, then you could lose your job. And that's a personal choice. If you're personal choice as to I want to do recreational marijuana and I will risk my job, then that's your choice. But there's a risk you can do that. And certain jobs, an employer has a right to regulate those job titles.
Are you allowed to bring marijuana with you to work? This is another question we had earlier. That depends on your employer.
Yeah, depends. And when you say bring to work, certainly if it's in your purse or if it's in your coat, I don't think there's anything illegal about that. However, your employer may say this is a drug-free zone, and we don't want drugs anywhere near there, and the employer has a right to do so. As we talked about at the beginning of the segment,
Schools, hospitals,
they have a right,
courthouses.
They have a right to say no. And so I will assume that most employers will say, I don't want that on the facility.
Do you foresee increased drug testing?
Well, drug testing for work injuries is already in place. A lot of employers have a right to do so. The issue becomes after the drug test, whose right supersedes the other person's right. Certainly now you have a right to recreationally smoke marijuana. Before January 1st of 2020, if you were tested positive, you lose your job. It was illegal. Now, that may be different. Employers are going to have to struggle with that to the fact that, yeah, you smoked marijuana and it's 2 weeks later and you have a positive THC finding on your drug test. Whose right supersedes the other right, the employer or that person who smoked? And that's something that's going to be litigated.
Because you could battle by saying, well, I didn't smoke while I was on duty or while I was at work. I did it over the weekend.
Right.
And now it's Monday, but it's still somewhat in your system.
Absolutely. I wasn't impaired when you test me.
Right.
I smoked a week ago, but it's still in your system.
Yeah.
And that's where the rights are going to collide at some point. And the court system is going to have to figure out, in that situation, whose right is going to be upheld over the others, the employers or the person who's tested positive.
What about government housing? This is an interesting one that I don't think we've touched on yet. A person who's living in government housing, can they smoke in their apartment or nearby?
Great question. Great question, and thank you for that. Once again, smoking marijuana is not legal from a federal standpoint. Government housing, Section 8A, is a federally funded program. You are not allowed to smoke marijuana if you are a Section 8 recipient or under federal housing. So no, just because Illinois passed the law, if you're receiving any type of federal assistance for living, you are not allowed to smoke marijuana in your residence.
Will medical marijuana be taxed the same way as recreational? Because this is going to be a revenue stream. Yeah. We're going to see changes in the way the taxes are done. Right. How does medical and then recreational compare to each other?
Well, that's a tough question, and maybe an accountant or a CPA can answer that. I know that recreational is going to be taxed. I'm not certain on how much the medical is taxed at this point. You got to remember this legalization of this is affecting taxes on different levels. There's licensing to the sellers. Right. There's licensing to the growers. So that's tax revenue on 3 different levels. The growers, potentially the people who transport it, and then the people who sell it. So there's a tax revenue base coming through all those aspects. I don't know whether or not there's a difference between medical and personal, and that's something that if you want to call me at my office, I can look into it and I can answer the question at a later date.
And insurance rates, how are we going to deal with that? Because, if you get in trouble with alcohol and driving, your insurance goes through the roof. Yeah. How do you foresee that happening with insurance with the recreational use of marijuana? If
you're under the legal limit and you're tested, I don't think your rates are going to be affected. If there's a conviction on your for being over the legal limits allowed, then I think your rates are potentially going to go up. I wanted to mention too that we haven't talked about is with this new law, if you have on your record a conviction for having marijuana under that level, that can be expunged. This new law actually retroactively allows you, if you have a minor violation for possession of marijuana, you can get that expunged off your record.
Minor violation.
Well, under the limit
right.
now. Yeah, absolutely. And there's some people who have that on their conviction. High school, college, and it was illegal. And if you have that, there is a chance to have that expunged from your record.
All right. I think we've got time for one more quick question. What happens if you have paraphernalia in the car and you get pulled over or you get in trouble?
Paraphernalia is not covered by this. I don't think it's illegal to have paraphernalia on you. However, if it's tied into marijuana or over marijuana, because what's going to happen is if they see paraphernalia, they're going to ask to search your car. And if you have the marijuana somewhere else, then it all starts adding up, and it's not going to be good for you.
Well, I think this was definitely one of our hottest topics so far. We may have to get into this again down the road.
I'm glad we did. Thank you.
But a lot of questions, a lot of concerns. And if people want to call you, give them your number.
It's 309-681-1900.
You can give them a call, ask your questions. there's going to be a lot of concern about this. It goes into effect on January 1, and a lot of things we still don't know. But Stephen Kelly can help you out. Give him a call and get all your questions answered. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I just want to say happy holidays to everybody out there. Have a good holiday.
All right, we appreciate you watching, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Welcome to Ask the Attorney, brought to you by Stephen Kelly Law.